Bring the security guy on Saturday. Let's see how long he lasts in a room full of people who actually belong there. Preston said it in a lobby on a Wednesday, loud enough for 3 people to hear. One of them was the man he meant. Adrian Vance had planned it to the last detail. 16 guests, 41 floors above Elliott Bay. The kind of people Preston called the ones who matter. And then, as a joke, she invited the man who spent every working day standing 3 steps behind her. Miles Tate had run her security detail for 19 months. Same white shirt, same dark suit, same distance every day. Present, functional, invisible. She expected awkward. She expected grateful. She expected a man drowning quietly in the wrong room. What none of them knew was that he had already seen something in that deal. Something nobody else at the table had. When the door opened on Saturday, Adrian stopped mid-sentence. The man in the entrance was nobody's joke. If you're new here, this channel tells stories about people who get underestimated and what happens when they finally stop letting it slide. Hit subscribe and stay with us. He arrived at 6:45 every morning, 15 minutes before Adrian needed him, 30 before anyone else in her orbit was functional. He did not spend those 15 minutes on his phone. He walked the block. Garage ramp on the north side, service entrance in the alley, the 2 sight lines from the parking structure across the street. On a Tuesday in March, he noted a gray sedan that had been sitting on the same stretch of curb 3 mornings running, wrote down the plate, and photographed it. Adrian noticed his punctuality the way a person notices a well-running elevator. Briefly, favorably, without a moment's curiosity about the mechanism behind it. In 19 months of working inside arm's reach of him, she had learned 4 things. He was 34. He was never late, not once, not in weather that closed half the city. He seemed to know every route through Seattle and every fire exit in every building she entered. And he did not speak unless she spoke first. That last one, more than the others, was what made him indispensable. She never learned anything else because she never asked. 3 years before Corvale Holdings, Miles Tate had been a senior operations and logistics analyst at a consulting firm in Bellevue. He built supply chain models. He found the places where money leaked out of systems everyone had assumed were sealed. He presented findings to boards of directors in rooms not meaningfully different from the ones Adrian used every week of her life. He was on a short list for director, and the people making that list had told him so. Then his father had the first stroke. The second came 6 weeks later while Miles was still learning the vocabulary of the first. Rehabilitation ran $4,000 a month at the low end. The home care that followed ran closer to $7,300. The firm offered condolences, a card signed by the whole floor, and 2 weeks of leave. Miles sat at his father's bedside for 1 long afternoon with a legal pad. He handed in his notice before the end of that week. An old friend from his reserve unit ran a small executive protection firm out of Georgetown. The money was steady, but the reason he took it, the only reason that mattered, was that a rotating schedule meant he could drive his father to physical therapy 3 mornings a week without asking anyone's permission. He trained the way the work demanded: threat assessment, route planning, situational awareness. 4 years in the field and he never once had to put a hand on anyone. That surprises people. It shouldn't. The job isn't the thing you see in films. The job is noticing a problem early enough that it never becomes one. It was not a defeat, it was a choice. The distinction mattered to him, even during the long stretch when it mattered to nobody else. He had tried telling the story once, in his first year, to a man in a good jacket who asked what he did before this. He got the wide eyes, the exaggerated interest. The questions that are really just politely dressed versions of, "Are you serious right now?" So he made a decision, quietly and without bitterness. Let people see what they've already prepared themselves to see, and leave the rest alone. Here is what the job looked like from the outside. A man standing near a door. Here is what it looked like from the inside. He had to know who was where, who was meeting whom, Which route had changed at the last minute and why? Which flight had moved? Which appointment had appeared on the calendar that morning and who put it there? And more than any of that, which meetings never made it onto the calendar at all? So he stood in hotel corridors. He sat in airport lounges with his back to a wall. He waited outside conference rooms while investor meetings ran 90 minutes long, and outside private dining rooms at industry events, and at the back of ballrooms during keynotes. Doors close. Doors are not soundproof, and a detail is always waiting. He wrote everything down, not out of suspicion, out of procedure, reinforced by 4 years of consulting where documenting your hours was as automatic as breathing. Date, time, location. Every deviation from an approved itinerary with a reason attached if one was given and a note if one wasn't. Those reports went to the protection firm. The firm rolled them into a monthly summary and sent it to Corvale's facilities office, where it was filed by date. Not to Adrian, not to legal, to facilities. Miles had learned a long time ago that the most important part of protection was noticing what everyone else assumed nobody would notice. He had not yet learned what happens when you keep doing that for 19 months. Understand something about Preston Hale, because the story does not work if you think he was a fool. He was, by a wide margin, the most effective operator in that building. He had built Corvale's Western expansion out of 2 contracts and a hypothesis. He knew every line of every deal he touched. He remembered the names of people's children. When a junior analyst put a decimal in the wrong place and cost the company $250,000, Preston stood up in front of the board and said the number had come through him, which was technically true and entirely voluntary, and that analyst still works there and would take a bullet for him. People liked working for Preston Hale. That is not a contradiction. That is how it usually goes. He simply did not consider Miles Tate to be a person who had opinions. "Wait outside, Chief. This one's above your clearance." That was the whole exchange most days, delivered in a 4th-floor corridor without Preston ever turning his head. And in November of the previous year, Miles brought him the photograph of the gray sedan, along with a name that had appeared twice on a guest list for a closed investor session. A man not employed by any of the participating firms, sponsored by nobody, added by an assistant who couldn't say who'd asked. Miles recommended he be removed from the list. Preston laughed. Not cruelly. He was in a good mood. The quarter was closing well. "That's what we pay you to worry about," he said. "Let the adults worry about the rest." Adrian was standing right there. She had the authority to overrule him in one sentence, and the sentence would have cost her nothing. She said nothing. The man attended the session. 11 days later, the material terms of a deal that had not been signed yet appeared in a trade publication, close enough to verbatim that Corvale's insurer opened a file and retained an outside forensic consultant, a quiet man named Warren Pike, who spent 6 weeks and found nothing conclusive. The deal survived. Barely. Corvale gave up 2 points on the payment schedule to keep it alive, and Adrian spent a very long February explaining it to people who did not want to hear it. She never once connected that February to the afternoon a man in a dark suit had told her something, and she had let Preston decide it was noise. Saying nothing was its own kind of statement, and Miles had learned to read those too. Corvale was hosting 16 people at Vantage House on Saturday. Lead investors in the infrastructure expansion, a few partner firm executives, and 2 people whose only apparent qualification was that Preston found them useful to know. He made the case for bringing Miles over 20 minutes in the back of the car, wrapped in language just reasonable enough that Adrian had to argue against it rather than reject it. It would be generous, a nice gesture toward the staff. Nobody needed to make a production of it. Miles stood 6 feet from the open door with his hands folded, watching the street. He heard all of it. That evening, on the way back to First Hill, Adrian leaned forward. "Saturday, the dinner at Vantage House. You should come as my guest." Miles let the block go by before he answered. "Is that an actual invitation?" he said. "Or am I the entertainment?" Adrian didn't answer right away either. She looked out the window at her own building coming up on the right, lit from the inside like a display case. And in the length of that silence, Miles heard the answer she wasn't willing to say out loud. "Just dress nicely," she said. He came around and held the door while she stepped out. He wished her a good evening. She walked inside without looking back. He knew exactly what Saturday was supposed to be. He had every reason to decline, but he had spent 19 months making himself smaller so everyone around him could stay comfortable. And somewhere on the I-5 interchange that night, with the city spread out in broken light on both sides, he decided he was finished with that particular accommodation. He wasn't going to refuse. He was going to accept it on his own terms. Saturday morning, he drove his father to physical therapy and read in the lobby for 50 minutes. A technical bulletin on West Coast port infrastructure, terminal automation, and the handling schedules that had been rebuilt around it. He read it completely once, then again on the parts that mattered. Saturday evening, he moved the boxes on the closet shelf until he found the flat black one. Midnight blue, cut close, made by a tailor on Capitol Hill who had charged him more than he should have spent and whom he had never regretted paying. Worn 4 times, all of them during the consulting years. In that box for 2.5 years. And standing there with the jacket in his hands, he came very close to putting it back. Not out of fear, out of arithmetic. He knew what the room would do with a man who showed up looking like he thought he belonged. He knew that dressing correctly for a joke does not stop it from being a joke. It just changes who has to carry it home. There was a version of Saturday where he wore something forgettable, ate quietly, and gave nobody anything to talk about. That version was safe, and he had been choosing the safe version for 2 years. He stood there for a while. Then he hung the tuxedo on the door and found the watch. Plain steel, white face, black strap, given to him by his father the week he accepted his first professional offer. Nothing expensive. Everything meaningful. No hidden fortune. No secret title concealed under the uniform. He had not become someone different. He had only decided to stop pretending he was less than he was. Maroom went quiet in that particular way rooms go quiet when something has disrupted the expected order of things. But before anyone finished reacting, Miles had already read it. 4 seconds, and it was not a decision. 2 exits. The main door and the service door behind the bar, which was closer and faster. A building officer in the corridor standing with his weight on the wrong foot. 16 chairs, 3 with clean sight lines to both doors, one of those 3 with a wall behind it. He took that one. He wasn't performing any of it. He'd lost the ability to switch it off somewhere in year 2, the way a carpenter can't walk into a house without reading the joinery. Adrian stopped mid-sentence. It was not the tuxedo, though the tuxedo was impeccable. It was the way he moved, unhurried, deliberate, making no apology for being there and no performance of it either. He greeted the people nearest him with a handshake and eye contact, and no excess of words. He sat. He opened the menu like a man who has sat at tables like this and already knows roughly what he wants. A younger associate from Cadence Partners watched the whole thing and grinned. "You pick that seat awfully fast. You scan a room like security." Miles unfolded his napkin. "I am security," he said, and went back to the menu. A few people laughed, the easy, relieved laugh of a table that has decided a thing is charming. Francis Doyle did not laugh. Cadence's senior partner, 65, silver-haired, the kind of composed that only arrives after 4 decades of not being surprised very often. She looked at him 1 full second longer than politeness required. Across the table, Preston Hale set down his glass and started rebuilding his plan. He made his first move before the appetizers, folded into conversation so smoothly the aggression inside it was nearly invisible. He asked Miles what he thought of the Barolo, specific vintage, somewhat obscure. The kind of question designed less to learn anything than to establish where a person stands in relation to a room. Miles had already looked at the bottle when the sommelier presented it, because he looked at everything. He named the producer. He named the commune. He described the profile of that vintage year in about 2 sentences, and noted it would sit better against the lamb than the fish, which happened to be what he'd ordered. There was nothing mystical about how he knew. 4 years of client galas and firm dinners, standing in rooms exactly like this one with a glass in his hand and a name badge on his lapel. Not a secret. Just a life nobody at that table had thought to assume he'd had. He set the glass down and went back to his bread. That was the part that got under Preston's skin. Not the answer. The complete absence of any interest in having scored a point. Preston's expression didn't change. Something behind it did. He waited until the conversation broadened, then tried again. 2 of the Cadence people had drifted onto container rates and the volatility of the last 2 quarters. Preston inserted himself, let it run, then pivoted it with practiced ease. What did Miles think? Purely curious. Miles answered for about 90 seconds. He named the specific corridor disruptions driving the spread, separated the structural ones from the ones that would resolve inside 2 quarters, and traced the downstream effect on West Coast port scheduling, which was the part that actually mattered to anyone at that table. One of the Cadence representatives turned in her chair to face him. The other leaned in. Preston's jaw tightened by a fraction of a degree. He waited until the main course. By then, the table had found its center, the infrastructure bid. $840 million, 3 Western states, the largest contract in the company's history and the reason half that room had flown in. Preston walked them through it with the confidence of the man who had architected it. Because he had. Structure, terms, projected margins. He was fluent, and he was genuinely good. And for 6 or 7 minutes, the table was his. Somewhere in the middle of it, one of the partner firm executives raised a glass and congratulated him on the new advisory seat. Preston waved it off. Small thing, 3 meetings a year, and steered straight back to the deal. Then he shared what he clearly regarded as the crown jewel. We locked the Western port legs at the previous handling schedule. Same rates we negotiated 3 years ago. That's where the margin comes from. That's the whole bid. Francis Doyle wrote something in a small notebook. Then Preston looked across the table. Of course, this is the kind of thing that takes years of background to really appreciate. No offense intended. It was the no offense that gave the move away. That small disclaimer is always the sound of a man telling you he knows exactly what he's doing. Miles set down his fork. He did not need a single confidential document to answer what had just been said. He needed 3 things, and he had all 3 legitimately. The first was that Preston had just described the assumption out loud in front of 16 people. The second was that port handling schedules are published. They are public tariff filings, and Miles had pulled them 3 weeks earlier in a physical therapy waiting room, because port infrastructure was still what he read about when he had 50 minutes and nothing to do with them. The third was that he had spent 4 years building exactly this kind of model for a living. Those rates were replaced 18 months ago, Miles said. He said it evenly, with no lift in his voice, the way you'd correct a colleague's arithmetic. Every one of those corridors rebuilt their handling schedule after the terminal automation went in. New fee structure, new gate charges, new demurrage terms. It's published. Anyone at this table can pull the filings tonight. He paused because he wanted to be certain he had it right before he said the rest. If that model still runs on the old schedule, your real cost structure in the first 14 months comes in somewhere around $50 million higher than the number you just described. Which means you wouldn't be winning that bid. You'd be committing to a price you can't deliver at and finding out in month 4. The table went quiet. Not the polite quiet of people being courteous to a newcomer. A different quiet altogether. The kind that falls when something important has just been said, and every person in the room is rapidly reassessing what they thought they knew. Francis Doyle set down her glass. That wasn't a security observation. Where did you learn to read a cost model? He's security, Preston had answered before Miles could open his mouth. His voice stayed light, but there was a tightness at the edges of it now that hadn't been there an hour earlier. Miles runs Adrian's detail. He's here as a guest. It landed as an evasion, and everyone heard it land that way. Francis had asked where a man learned something. Preston had answered with what the man was paid to do, which is not the same question and is never an accident. Miles looked at him and did not look away, and did not fill the silence with anything conciliatory. "That's right," he said. He set his glass down without hurrying. "And the thing about standing outside the room is that you hear everything the people inside it are too busy saying to notice." Francis looked from Miles to Preston and back. Then she made a small sound that was not quite a laugh but occupied the same territory and picked up her wine. Preston Hale did not speak again for several minutes. Adrian found him on the balcony with his jacket still buttoned, looking out over Elliott Bay. The water was dark. The city lights moved across it in broken lines. She came and stood beside him. She did not open with an apology, which he appreciated more than she knew. "Why did you never say anything? About your background? About what you did before this?" Miles was quiet a moment. When he answered, he didn't look at her. "Do you remember the Portland renegotiation? November, year before last? The Cascadia contract. You were on the phone 40 minutes. You told them you were prepared to walk if they didn't move on payment terms." "You weren't prepared to walk. You needed it to close the quarter. But you said it convincingly enough that they believed you, and they moved 11 days later." Adrian said nothing. "I was standing 6 feet from that door," Miles said. "You never once considered whether I understood what I was hearing." He turned to look at her then. "That's not an accusation. I'm telling you what it was like." She started to say something. He didn't stop her exactly. He just kept going, and she found she wanted to hear it. "You didn't keep things from me because you thought I might use them. You never thought about keeping them from me at all. The man on the detail wasn't a person in that calculation. He was part of the background." Adrian felt that land somewhere specific and uncomfortable. "I know why I was invited tonight," he said, not unkindly. "And I think you know that I know. Preston thought it would be funny. You were curious what would happen. Neither of those is the same thing as wanting me in the room. There's a difference between being invited to a table and being seen as someone who belongs at one. I'm not sure you've thought about which one tonight was." Adrian didn't have a ready answer. She had built a professional life on having ready answers, and the absence of one was unfamiliar in a way she didn't know how to manage. When she did speak, it came out quieter than she'd meant it to. "Last November, you brought me a name on a guest list." "I remember." "I let Preston tell me it was nothing. You've spent 19 months protecting me, and I don't think I ever once asked myself who I'd handed that job to." She told him she was sorry. The words were simple, and she didn't dress them up. Miles nodded once. He didn't perform forgiveness, and he didn't withhold it cruelly. He acknowledged that she'd said it, which was its own kind of response. "Go back inside. Cadence is going to want to talk about that cost model before they leave. You should be in that conversation, not hearing about it Monday." She looked at him a moment longer. Then she went back inside. The strategy team ran a full review that Monday. The numbers came back exactly as he'd described them. The transition model had been built against a handling schedule superseded 18 months earlier, and nobody had rerun it, because nobody thinks to ask whether a settled input has stopped being settled. Left alone, it would have produced a shortfall of roughly $50 million in the first cycle of a contract Corvail would have been legally bound to deliver. Nobody had cheated. Nobody had hidden anything. It was an honest piece of obsolescence sitting in a spreadsheet, load-bearing and unexamined, for a year and a half. That is what made it hurt. The bid was pulled and rebuilt before submission. Adrian did not call him that night. She spent the week doing something she had never bothered to do in 19 months. She looked him up. She pulled the consulting firm's public case index and found his name on 4 published engagements. She called a former managing director in Bellevue who took 10 minutes to place the name and then talked for 20. She had HR send Miles a closed-book assessment, a live procurement file, 48 hours, a written recommendation, and gave the same file to 2 members of her existing strategy team without telling any of the three that the others had it. His came back the strongest of the three. It was also the only one that flagged what the file was missing. Then she called his personal number, which had been sitting in her assistant's contacts for 19 months and which she had never once used. 90-day trial, operational strategy team, logistics risk assessment, evaluated on results, and nothing else. Miles was quiet long enough that she thought the line had dropped. I'll take it, but I want it in writing. Evaluation criteria, deliverables, what success looks like and who decides. He waited long enough for her to answer before he added the rest. And I want to be measured against the same standard as anyone else in that room. Not lowered because you feel bad about a dinner. Not raised because you're proving a point. The same. Understood, Adrian said. Taking it meant leaving the protection firm outright. There was no version where he kept a foot in each. He gave notice on a Tuesday and worked his last shift that Friday, and his father's care invoice came due on the 1st of the month exactly as it always had. One clause in the transition agreement would matter enormously later, and it was entirely deliberate. Adrian asked him to spend the first 30 days closing out a security risk handover, an assessment of Corvale's own physical access posture, written by the only person who understood both sides of it. That required his executive floor clearance to stay live alongside his new strategy credential. It was discussed. It was documented. Legal reviewed it. Facilities signed it. For 30 days, Miles Tate was the only person in that building holding both sets of keys, and every single person who mattered knew it. Preston understood immediately what Miles's presence on the strategy team meant, and he responded the way he responded to anything he found threatening. Methodically, with a surface layer of cordiality that made the aggression difficult to name out loud. In the first 2 weeks, Miles was left off the distribution list for 3 internal briefings. When he raised it, the omissions were attributed to an administrative error and corrected with an efficiency that suggested they'd been deliberate. The data sets for his first 2 assignments were incomplete in ways that only surfaced once he tried to run the analysis. Missing variables, reference figures 2 cycles stale. The kind of gap that makes your work look sloppy if you don't catch it, and makes you look difficult if you go back and ask. The third one was better, and Miles didn't see it coming. Preston moved a submission deadline forward by 2 days, and confirmed it verbally in a hallway with a senior analyst present. Then, he never sent the calendar update. Miles delivered on the original date. In the Thursday meeting, Preston accepted the delay with visible grace. Entirely my fault for not putting it in writing. We've all been there. And in doing so, established in front of 11 people that Miles Tate was the kind of hire who needed things put in writing. That one worked. It worked for weeks. And there was a fourth thing, which was not sabotage at all. 3 weeks in, Miles flagged a 15% cost variance in the Spokane corridor and took it to the operations review as a live finding. Preston listened to all of it. Then he explained, without any visible pleasure, that the variance was a scheduled seasonal reclass that had run every 3rd quarter for 6 years, and that anyone who had worked a full annual cycle would have recognized it on sight. He was right. Miles had been working from 11 months of data and hadn't known there was a 12th. Miles said so, in the room, in 1 sentence, and did not say it again. But he thought about it for a long time that night. Not because Preston had been unkind, he hadn't been. Because for about 4 hours, Miles genuinely could not tell whether he was a man who saw things other people missed, or a man who had gotten lucky once at a dinner party and was now overreaching in front of people who would never let him forget it. That question did not fully go away. He worked anyway. He corrected his mistakes without drama. He built every finding with supporting evidence at each step, because he understood something about the room he was standing in. Where a man's credibility is already contested, everything he produces gets examined at a threshold that does not apply to anyone else. With access to procurement history for the first time, he noticed something that didn't sit right. Corvale had been losing bids it should have won. Not many, 6 over 2 years, enough to matter and not enough to alarm anyone. And it had lost them narrowly. Not by the wide margins that suggest a pricing problem, by the kind of margin that comes from someone knowing precisely what number they need to beat. He did not go investigating. He remembered. The Fairhaven Inn in Tacoma, an unremarkable business hotel off the interstate, the kind of place people use for meetings that don't appear on calendars. Preston Hale had gone there 7 times in 19 months, and every one of those visits had been a deviation from an approved security itinerary, which is exactly the category of event a protection specialist is contractually required to record. A route change requested after the day's plan was confirmed, twice. The detail told to wait in the parking structure instead of the lobby. A scheduled stop dropped with no explanation offered. And once, getting out of the car in the rain, "You don't need to log this one." Miles logged it anyway. He logged all of it, and filed it the way he filed everything because that was the job. And the job did not contain an exception for men who found it inconvenient. He had been carrying the entire record for 19 months without knowing what it was. Then he did the part that took the longest, which was trying to break it. 2 of the 6 losses had an obvious alternative explanation. A regional competitor had spent most of that period buying market share at a loss and had underbid everyone on everything, Corvale included. Miles pulled their public filings and their announced contract wins and spent 2 evenings establishing that the pricing war had ended 8 months before 2 of the losses in question. That mattered. Without it, the pattern was a coincidence with good timing. And one of the 7 Tacoma visits lined up with nothing at all. No bid, no suspension, no outcome, nothing within 6 weeks in either direction. He wrote that one down too, in the same column as the others, without an asterisk. Then there was the money. Inside the operational audit trail, read-only access granted to him in writing, scoped to his risk assessment and nothing wider, the reimbursements for those trips had been routed through a project code that Corvale's own records showed had been formally closed 14 months earlier. He wrote the code on a legal pad. He did not download anything. He did not print anything. He did not carry a single internal document out of that building because he knew without being told that the standard of proof required of him was not the standard required of anyone else, and that evidence he wasn't entitled to hold would be the easiest thing in the world to turn around. That Thursday, he missed his father's afternoon session. He'd been rebuilding the timeline since 6 that morning and simply lost the hour. His father never mentioned it, which was worse than if he had. Miles sat with the whole thing for a long time, and for 1 bad hour that night, he wondered whether he was doing it again, whether he was a man who had built a shape out of noise because he wanted the shape to be there, the way he had wanted the Spokane variants to be real. So he decided to give it 2 more weeks and 1 more test. He never got them. Preston moved first, 9 weeks into a 90-day trial, which meant Miles could still be removed without cause, and which was almost certainly not a coincidence. And 3 days before Corvale was scheduled to submit the rebuilt $840 million bid, the confidential bid file was accessed and transmitted to an external address. The trail led to a system account issued in Miles Tate's name. And this is why it was so difficult to dismiss. Miles was not just a new analyst with a login. He was, by documented and deliberate company decision, the only person in that building holding both a strategy credential and full executive floor access. It was in his transition agreement. Legal had reviewed it. Facilities had signed it. On paper, he was the single best positioned person at Corvale Holdings to do exactly what someone had just done. And the paperwork proving it had Adrian Vance's signature at the bottom. Preston chose the right knife, and she had handed it to him herself. He brought it to her within the hour. Access logs and a recovered email showing Miles's account sending a compressed file to an outside address. He presented it with the measured gravity of a man performing a duty he did not want. He recommended immediate termination and referral to counsel. Adrian called Miles into her office that afternoon and closed the door. She had read the file twice. She sat across from him and looked at him the way she had looked at difficult things her entire career. Directly, without blinking, measuring. She asked him one question. "Did you do this?" Miles didn't answer. He looked at her, and the silence went past the point where a denial would have been natural, and then past the point where it would have been comfortable. Somewhere on the floor below them, a phone rang twice and stopped. Out the window behind her, a container ship was making its slow way north up the Sound, and he watched it clear the frame of the glass before he said anything at all. He was not deciding whether to lie. He was deciding how much of himself to put down in a room that might not protect it. And he was doing that arithmetic with a woman who had, 9 weeks earlier, made him the only man in the building with both sets of keys. "No," who said. She started to say something after that. She never got to it because he was already standing. He took the security credential out of his inside jacket pocket and set it on the desk between them. The badge that had opened every door in that building for 22 months. The badge she had personally asked him to keep. 19 months I walked into every room ahead of you and then stepped out of the way. His voice did not rise at any point. After the dinner, after the balcony, I thought maybe something had changed. He looked at her steadily, and there was no anger in it, which was somehow worse than if there had been. "The fact that you had to ask me that question tells me exactly how far we actually got." He walked to the door, opened it, and left without looking back. Behind him, Adrian Vance sat with a badge, a folder, and the long, uncomfortable residue of a question she had asked and could not now unask. Adrian did not sleep. She read the file a second time, then a third, looking for the things she'd missed on the first 2 passes. The detail that would resolve the discomfort she'd been carrying since he left that badge sitting on her desk like a period at the end of a sentence she hadn't finished writing. She was good at reading evidence. She had built Corvale on her ability to look at a set of facts and understand what they were actually saying rather than what they appeared to say. It was the skill she trusted most in herself. Applied now, it was telling her something was wrong. 3 things, in order of how much they mattered. The transmitted archive carried creation metadata. The file had been assembled at 4:12 in the morning Pacific time on a Tuesday, and Miles Tate's building access log put him inside the parking structure at 6:39 that same morning, arriving, as he had every working day for 2 years, from an apartment 11 miles south. The account authentication came from a session that had never once appeared in his previous 9 weeks of login history. Different sequence, different order of operations. People are creatures of habit at keyboards in ways they never notice, and the email itself was too clean. She had read 40 of his memos by then, and this didn't sound like any of them. It read as assembled rather than written. She flagged it and set it aside, because she knew perfectly well that a hunch about someone's prose style is not evidence of anything and would be demolished in about 4 minutes by any competent attorney. In the morning, she called Warren Pike. She had his number because Corvale's insurer had retained him 14 months earlier, after a set of unsigned deal terms turned up in a trade publication and nobody could explain how. He had spent 6 weeks on that and found nothing conclusive, and he had told her so plainly instead of manufacturing a conclusion, which was the reason she was calling him now. She did not route the engagement through the EVP's office. Miles, meanwhile, was not doing nothing. He'd gone home, made dinner, and sat with his father through the evening news, letting the silence of the apartment do what silence does when you stop fighting it. The care invoice for the coming month sat unopened on the kitchen table. He didn't mention it. There was nothing to say about it his father didn't already know. During a commercial, Marvin Tate looked at his son and spoke with the directness the strokes had somehow sharpened rather than dulled. "You didn't do it." "No," Miles said. His father nodded once and turned back to the television, and that was both the end of the conversation and everything that needed to be said inside it. After he was asleep, Miles opened the folder he'd kept across all 22 months. Not company records. His records. The ones that belonged to him. Approved itineraries, deviation reports he had personally filed. Toll receipts, parking validations, shift logs, mileage. 2 years of a man doing his job correctly when nobody was watching, organized by month. On the third morning, his phone showed a missed call from Adrian, placed at 6:45. He called back. She answered on the first ring. "I need to show you something, and I think you need to show me something. Can you come in?" "Not to the building." There was a short silence while she reworked the plan. "Vantage house, private room, this afternoon." "I'll be there." Adrian chose the restaurant deliberately. If this went where she believed it was going, she wanted Preston Hale 41 floors and 11 blocks from his own office and his own devices for as long as it took legal and IT to secure both. She told him she was convening an emergency session on the breach, that counsel would attend, and that she needed him there as EVP to speak to operational context. She told him none of the rest. He walked in and stopped. Miles was already seated, not a tuxedo, a charcoal suit simply cut, and in front of him a manila folder and a carefully arranged stack of printed pages. 2 people from legal, and the quiet man at the end of the table who had been taking notes since before anyone else arrived. "What is this?" "Sit down, Preston," Adrian said. Miles began with his own material and only his own material. Approved itineraries by date, the deviation reports he had filed against them, toll receipts, parking validations, shift logs with arrivals and departures, 7 visits to the Fairhaven Inn with dates and durations, and beside each one, the corresponding procurement event. He was precise. He was unhurried. He did not editorialize once, and when he got to the 4th visit, he stopped and said that this one matched nothing. No bid, no suspension, no outcome within 6 weeks in either direction. That he had no explanation for it, and was including it because leaving it out would have been dishonest. Warren Pike looked up from his notes for the first time. Preston pushed back in layers, and each layer met a document, but not from Miles. "Those meetings were personal. I'm not required to justify my evenings to a former contractor." Adrian placed the reimbursement records on the table because they were her company's records and not his. "You expense them, all 7, through project code 4419, which our own system shows was formally closed 14 months before the first of those trips. That's a clerical error. Finance flagged it. It's being corrected." She placed a second sheet beside the first. The corrections began 4 days after Miles's first week on the strategy team, 4 days after he was granted read access to the operational audit trail, which was the first moment anyone outside your office could have seen that code at all. Preston did not have a third layer ready. Pike spoke for about 6 minutes, in the flat, unhurried register of a man who has delivered bad news in a lot of conference rooms. The transmission attributed to Miles's account had originated from a device registered in Corvale's asset inventory under a serial number that was not the laptop issued to Miles Tate. Physical access logs placed that device on the 4th floor on each of the 3 occasions Miles's credentials were used. The 4th floor was Preston Hale's. The archive's creation timestamp put its assembly at 4:12 in the morning, a window during which Miles Tate's own access record, the one his security credential generated automatically every time he touched a reader, placed him nowhere near the building. "Ms. Vance identified that before I did," Pike said. "The linguistic inconsistency in the email supports it, but I wouldn't lead with that. The timestamps do the work." Then he turned one more page. "There's also a disclosure issue. Mr. Hale holds an advisory position with the firm that won 4 of these 7 contracts. It's structured through a holding entity, and it isn't in his annual filing. It's the same seat he was congratulated on at a dinner in this room in March." Preston's hands were flat on the table. His face had gone through a series of small recalibrations and settled into an expression that was no longer quite any recognizable thing. He looked at Miles. "You were security," he said. "It came out differently than it had 4 months earlier at this same table. Not contemptuous, not performed. He was still trying to fit the original version of events over the shape of what was in front of him, and finding that it no longer went on. "Yes," Miles said. He looked back without heat and without mercy. The steady look of a man who has spent a long time being underestimated and has made a precise and considered peace with it. "That's why it never occurred to you that I was writing all of it down." Preston Hale did not speak again. Adrian suspended him on the spot pending full investigation. Legal took his credentials before he stood up. Building security met him at the elevator. Pike's findings went to outside counsel that afternoon. What happens after that is slow and mostly invisible, and does not resemble anything you have seen on television. A referral, a file number, a process that would take the better part of 2 years and would still be open long after everyone in that room had stopped thinking about it every day. The bid, its confidentiality no longer compromised, went out the following week. Adrian found him in the lobby as the meeting dispersed. She did not have a prepared speech. She was a person who generally had prepared speeches, and she was aware of the absence of one in a way that felt appropriate, as though arriving without one was the only honest way to start. "I should have known it wasn't you." "Yes," Miles said. He said it without cruelty, the way you agree with something that is simply true. "I want to offer you the role formally, not the trial. Director of Strategic Risk and Operations. Full title, full scope, reporting to me." He looked out through the lobby windows a moment. Seattle was doing its ordinary midday business. The waterfront, the traffic, a gray sky still deciding whether to commit to rain. "I don't want to be a gesture. I don't want to be the thing you did to correct what happened. I've spent enough of my life being whatever other people needed me to represent." Adrian didn't look away. "Then hear it plainly. Corvale needs what you can actually do, not the version that makes me feel better about a dinner I handled badly." She paused long enough to make sure he understood she meant the next part too. "I'm asking because you're the right person for the role. There is no second reason. And Frances Doyle has asked me twice who caught the model error. Both times I had to tell her he doesn't work here anymore." Miles was quiet a moment. "I want the agreement drafted with specific evaluation criteria, deliverables, performance standards, review timeline. My own attorney reads it before I sign." He waited until she nodded before he finished. "And I want it to be real work. Not a title attached to a desk in a corner, visible enough to make a point, and isolated enough not to disturb anything." "I'll have it drafted this week," she said. "You set the terms for what real means." He accepted. The months after that were not simple because nothing real is. He disagreed with her in meetings 3 times in the first quarter, and on each occasion she listened, pushed back where she had reasons to, and updated her position where she didn't. He was wrong once of those 3 and said so. The architecture they built, a monitoring layer that tracked operational anomalies across Corvale's entire logistics network and routed them to a human being instead of a filing cabinet, reduced unplanned contract losses by 31% in its first operating cycle. The man who had spent 19 months protecting one person from a room was now designing how an entire organization protected itself. The message came on a Thursday evening. "Dinner at Vantage House?" Miles was at his kitchen table with a procurement risk report. He read it twice before answering. "Business?" Her reply came in under a minute. "No, and this time nobody's the joke." Saturday evening he dressed carefully. Not the midnight blue tuxedo, something quieter. A charcoal suit that fit the occasion without making a statement of it. He wound the steel watch his father had given him and put it on. He checked the mirror once and was satisfied with what he saw. Not because of what he was wearing, but because of the man inside it, who had not changed and had never needed to. He drove himself downtown and parked 2 blocks away. For 19 months he had gone through that door first, checked the room, and then stepped back to a spot 3 paces behind her where nobody had any reason to look. Tonight he went through the door and sat down across from her. Not ahead of her, not behind her, not watching the room on her behalf, across from her. Adrian stood when she saw him. A small gesture, unrehearsed, the kind that means more precisely because nothing about it was calculated. She recognized him. Not the way you recognize someone you saw last week. The way you recognize someone you have finally learned how to see. They sat in a room where 16 people had once waited for him to confirm their assumptions. The table was different. The people were different. Most of all, the two of them were different. Not in ways that can be measured, but in the way that matters most. Neither of them was pretending anymore that one of them was invisible. At some point in the evening, she set down her glass. "I've been thinking about what you said on the balcony, about the difference between being invited to a table and being seen as someone who belongs at one." She turned the glass once on the cloth. "I've been trying to work out how long I've been making that mistake, not just with you, in general." "That's a long project," Miles said. "I know." She held his eyes across the table. "I thought you should know I've started it." Outside the windows, Elliott Bay caught the city lights and held them in the dark water below. "Good," he said, and meant it. Miles Tate never became a different person. What changed was not Miles. What changed was that the people around him finally ran out of reasons not to see him. The ones who underestimated him were not paying attention. That turned out to be their problem. If you've ever been the one standing outside the room while the world had its conversations inside it, this one was for you. Subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it.